I'd like to start with a story. It goes back almost 30 years ago and involves two characters some of you know. Myself and a young man at the time newly ordained by the name of Rick McGee. Ever heard of him? Yeah. For those of you that don't know Rick, he was my predecessor here in this congregation and has never managed to lose the love of the people. Go figure. 30 years ago, I was a young ordinand. That means I was eligible for ordination in the United Church of Canada. I had studied at Queen's Theological College. I had received my master's degree, and I was presenting myself to the United Church for ministry. And there's a committee structure, being every good bureaucratic organization that we are, there is a committee structure you have to go through, and we have this thing called a conference interview committee, who deems people to be qualified for ordination. It was a 3-day meeting, and one of the newest and youngest members of that committee was a fellow by the name of Rick McGee, and I was one of the ones he had to examine. And the question came up as to what was my calling, or what was my sense of call. For those of you who know me, I haven't always been quick to censor what I think and say. And so I flippantly replied to these people who had great power over me that I'd never been called by God. I'd been nagged. Nagged into presenting myself as a minister. The one who smiled first, the one who I took note of the most, and the one who was the gentlest on me from that moment on was Rick. The rest kind of looked at me like I had some kind of anathema attached to me, but they finally figured out what I meant. I had never intended to be a minister. I was going to work in the woods. I was going to be a forest ranger. I had no love of people. I am shy, and I would rather be by myself than with a group of people at most times. I, in those days, was known to go off snowshoeing and skiing by myself, and with no one else around, go camping on my own, go canoeing on my own. Even to this day, my social activity, motorcycling, is something you generally do by yourself, even in a group. And I am terrified speaking in public. I have gotten used to it 30 years later, but if you ask me on the spot to stand up and speak, it takes me a while to get up enough nerve to do it. Not likely candidate for ministry, so my response was correct. I had never intended to be a minister, but every time I went down some path, some avenue, some attempt to follow any other career path in my life, I kept coming up against this door being closed. Every door would close, and somebody would say to me about ministry. There would always be this comment, some connection, something within the church. I grew up as a minister's son, so I was around church people all the time, and they seemed to think I had the skills, qualities, and understanding to do this position. Talk about connections. One man who was very, very evident in helping me to understand that I should probably be looking at the church is the man you folk bought your house from. Mr. Don Lane, a resident of this city who had a big impact in me in church life. So eventually I started to say that every time God closed the door, a window opened someplace, and I had to crawl through it, and I kept hearing this voice saying, do this. Well, here it is. 30 years later, I'm here. Nagged into being a minister, but not objecting about it anymore. But what I want to talk to you about is I had the same kind of experience that Samuel had. Samuel kept hearing a voice calling to him in the night. And he'd go up and think, that's Eli calling me, and he'd tear off down the hallway to find Eli. till eventually Eli said to him, "Look, son, it really isn't me. This isn't the hallway you need to be walking down. The next time you hear that voice, you simply stay where you are and say, 'Yes, Lord, your servant is listening.'" It's a wonderful experience. It's led me to a lot of different places, this thing called ministry and calling. But I've also come to understand calling in many other ways. How many people here would say you have a calling? Seriously, hands up. Thank you. The reality is we all have some sort of calling to something. If you don't believe me, remember 10, 15 minutes ago. Debbie, standing over here, telling you that she is excited. And she's become almost monolithic in her conversations about the mission trip to Swaziland, the return for her to Swaziland as we had been there earlier this year, or last year, I guess now. She is excited about going to some place where she's going to get on an airplane and sit for upwards of 18 hours nonstop. Go to a place of 30-plus degree heat with 90+% humidity, where we both know the snakes are rampant, and she really doesn't like snakes, and the insects and the malaria and the cholera and the poverty and all the rest of it. And she's excited about that. Doris is this moment standing in a pulpit, my former congregation actually in Belleville at Eastminster United, talking about her trips to Peru and the upcoming trip to Guatemala on top of the Swaziland trip. Doris, who went 11 hours up the Amazon River in a skiff amongst the piranhas and the crocodiles and the anacondas to work with the people on the upper reaches of the Amazon. We all know Doris. Doesn't sound like Doris to us, does it? Why do these people do these things? It's called a calling. How many people here supported a local mission in the last year? Gave of their hard-earned money or hard-earned pensions or whatever it was. That's a calling, to reach out and reach into your hand, into your pocket, and to reach out and to give to someone else. It's responding to a voice that says, I should do this. You may be like me. You may feel that it's a nagging sense of you will not have the right life unless you walk down this path, unless you do this thing, unless you take care of this moment. The sense that a neighbor needs you. Ever had that? The sense of a family member in distress, looking at a stranger sitting on a bench in a mall and passing the time with them because you sense in them some need. That's a calling. The problem with people who sit in pews and people who preach from pulpits is that we have taken the word calling and made it some great higher glorious thing. Being elevated to the ordained ministry is considered a calling. It is. Some are called to do this. But in Scripture it says we are all called to do something. There are many gifts. There are many ways. Samuel didn't know what the voice was asking him to do that night in his bed as a small boy. He just knew that it was a voice speaking to him, calling him to another aspect of life. A calling is hearing a voice, but there's another side to it. If you're not prepared to know yourself, then you're not prepared to hear the voice. You have to understand who is being called. I can tell you that after 30 years of ministry and responding to a call or a nagging, and having the good humor of the committee members accept that and think that, okay, crazy as he is, he might have some gifts that we can use in the church, and putting me through to ministry. But I have to tell you, I was not called to be an ordained minister. That's the avenue and the approach I took to exercise my call. It took me many years to understand that part. I thought I was called to being a United Church minister. A few years ago, there were some radical changes in my life that led me to taking some time off from ministry, from employment within the United Church, let's put it that way. More appropriately, I ceased to actually walk into a congregation for a period of 18 months and preach and do this work. I took time off to do other things. At no time did I cease to be a minister. Just as many people found their way to my door or called me up, or that I would find in places where I ended up doing just as, but I basically did the same thing without actually having an attachment to a particular congregation. And I discovered that my calling was to be. Just to be. And that my being responds to God by caring for other people. And if you don't believe me, come and spend a week at my house. Because it's a pretty busy place. I live alone, except for my youngest is with me at times. But my place has constantly got neighbors and strangers. And this weekend, I spent half of the weekend talking with a former parishioner from Quebec, a man I haven't laid eyes on for 10 years, 12 years, or longer, who's having some troubles in his life as he lives in Magog, Quebec, and he's been on the phone to me and talking and chatting and whatever. I'm not his minister, but I am his minister. Do you know what I mean? The call to be is what I'm talking about. The call to be. The call to be the one God has called you to be. Do you know who that is? Have you taken the time to figure it out? People like Doris and Debbie and some of the others that take the trips have taken the time to figure out, yeah, that's a part of their being, that's a part of what they need to do in this life. People who serve on community groups and organizations and realize that that's an important part of who they are. People who get involved in something because it's about who they are. Not about what they want to achieve, not about a sense of power, not about a sense of prestige, but their sense of being. This is how I respond to God's love in my life. Calling begins by knowing. Knowing who it is and what it is you're listening for. Old Eli was wise enough to say to young Samuel, next time you hear the voice, I'm going to switch this from a statement to a question. The next time you hear the voice, what are you supposed to do?
Stop and listen.
Stop and listen. Not run off and do something. Not acquire a position. Not establish a foundation. Not be madly running about anything. You're to stop and listen. And what are you listening for? Direction. A sense of self. A connection. Have you ever had a dialogue with a person you don't know? Have you ever had a dialogue with somebody who you do not want them to know you in any way, shape, or form? It's not really a conversation, is it? In other words, if you're going to have a conversation with God, you have to have an understanding of who God is. And you cannot understand who God is. We are not capable of fully understanding all there is of God, so we have to understand who God is talking to and talking with. You have to understand yourself. In Celtic spirituality, in the old Celtic church, they have a phrase. It's called Anam Cara. It means soul friend. It's Gaelic. And in the concept of soul friend within the Christian Celtic circles, it goes like this. In your lifetime, you can meet possibly one or two soul friends. Friends at the heart and the ground of all your being. It says that of those soul friends that you meet, hopefully and understandably, one of them will be Christ. You could have possibly another human one, but you can't have another human one until you have yourself as one first. A soul friend is one who knows you to the core of your being. No illusions, no covering up, no defenses, total, true understanding. So to have Christ as a soul friend means that Christ is going to know you at the core of your being, and you're going to know Christ at the core of your being. But you won't do any of this until you know yourself there too. We live with illusion. We live with the sense of what we think we should do or want to do or how we should be. We live in this capacity because we're taught from a very early age in life to put on the mantles of proper behavior and proper understanding and proper knowing. And, you know, I still remember being taught that the sky is always blue and the grass is always green, and there was something wrong with me if I saw it otherwise. Until I did see a green sky one time, and I have seen blue grass. And I realized there is more to knowing than what people tell you. And so answering God's call is knowing. It's opening, it's listening, and it's knowing. Knowing with whom the dialogue is being held. My inner self and my God. And then having a true dialogue and responding in faith to what that conversation leads me to. It led a shy 19-year-old to being the person who stands up here and has this conversation with you. It's led me to places where I thought I would never have gone or would have wanted to go. And I know that others I have had this conversation with over the years, even if it's sitting on airplanes over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean worrying about the wings falling off. That's my fear. It's led people to do things that they thought that they could never do, and they don't see themselves as extraordinary for doing it. Knowing in the heart and soul of your mind what you are called to do. It may simply be working at a soup kitchen or caring for your neighbors. It may be just being the best person you are ever meant to be. It's opening yourself up to God. A calling? If you are breathing, God is calling you. Callings are not left to the few or the mighty. A calling is to every person to make God's creation work. Next time you hear the voice or the niggling, just take a moment and say, "Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening."